In the previous class, we have discussed, measurement of price elasticity through a geometric method, and then we have proved the point elasticity formula, and then we have measured price elasticity on a non-linear demand curve, and then we have found out that on a linear demand curve, elasticity also varies from 0 to infinity. So we have discussed the measurement of price elasticity through the geometric method, and also measuring the elasticity or price elasticity in a non-linear demand curve. And then we also came to know that on a linear demand curve, elasticity varies from 0 to infinity, and that we have discussed. And moving on forward, we have to discuss about price elasticity, which varies at different points on a non-linear demand curve. So we have studied that on a straight line demand curve, the price elasticity varies from 0 to infinity, and here we are going to discuss about the non-linear demand curve. And it says that even on non-linear demand curve, price elasticity varies. They are different at every point. So different point will give you different price elasticity even on a non-linear demand curve. So let us see the first condition. Figure 11 gives the price elasticity which is varying at different points on a demand curve. And as we have discussed, to measure the price elasticity on a non-linear demand curve, we have to draw a tangent line touching the point of the demand curve, and that is exactly what we have done. So T dash is the tangent line touching the demand curve, which is non-linear DD. And again, at point S, it is also a tangent C between J dash and DD demand curve. So that is how we measure the price elasticity in case of a non-linear demand curve. So let us see on this non-linear demand curve how are the price elasticity differ from each other or from each point. So we have a a bit steeper demand curve, or the measurement of a flatter tangency point of demand curve at point R. I mean steeper. The flatter one is at point S, where we have a tendency between Z dash and D demand curve. So let us compare these 2 points. What are the price elasticity? What is the price elasticity at different point, that is R and S? So as we have explained above, price elasticity at a point R, on a demand curve DD will be found out, by drawing a tangent to the demand curve at this point. So thus elasticity at point R on demand curve will be RT dash divided by RT, because we have found out the formula or price elasticity at point R in the previous classes. And so the formula is lower segment divided by upper segment. So the price elasticity for this demand curve at point R will be given by RT dash divided by RT, which is price elasticity will be greater than 1 in this case, because the lower segment is greater than the upper segment. That is why price elasticity at point R is greater than 1. So let us see at point S. And as discussed, price elasticity of demand for demand curve DD is obtained by drawing a tangent straight line at point S. So J dash. So at point S, price elasticity at point S will be given by Sj dash divided by Sj. And here, price elasticity at point S is less than 1. Why? Because the lower segment Sj dash is smaller than the upper segment Sj. That is why in this case, the price elasticity at point S is less than 1. So what can we conclude from this is that, price elasticity at point S is less than that at point R on the demand curve DD. So price elasticity is less than 1 at point S, and price elasticity at point R is greater than 1. That is what we have found out in this diagram. So similarly, price elasticity at other points of the demand curve DD will be found to be different. Here, price elasticity is greater than 1, and at point S, price elasticity is less than 1. So even on the same demand curve, which is non-linear, every point on the demand curve, they will show a different price elasticity. So we can take, let's say, another point here. So it will be showing a different price elasticity like these 2 points. So there is an explanation of price elasticity which varies at different points on a demand curve which is non-linear. So next we are discussing a case where a rectangular hyperbola type demand curve is represented by the demand curve. And what is the price elasticity when the demand curve is in the rectangular hyperbola type? So let us see and explain the diagram. So when point price elasticity, this point of price elasticity of demand, when they are equal to unity, that is when the price elasticity at this point A, B, C, if all these points are equal to 1, if the price elasticity is equal to 1 throughout on a demand curve, the demand curve has the shape of this rectangular hyperbola. So when we talk about rectangular hyperbola, it is a curve, So this DD is a curve at which rectangles formed at every point on it have the same area. So rectangular hyperbola means this curve which is giving the rectangle, that is at point A we have a rectangle that is 0, 8, A2. So this rectangle will be equal to this rectangle. And then again, these 2 rectangles will be equal to this rectangle again. So this type of, demand curve is referred to as rectangular hyperbola. And this rectangular hyperbola type demand curve occurs when their price elasticity at every point on the demand curve is equal to 1, or we have unitary price elasticity. So the area at point A, B, C, their, area is all the same. So let us see at point A, we have rectangle here. So the total expenditure, which is equal to area, will be price into quantity, that is 8 into 2 is 16. So here the total expenditure, or we can say which is the area for rectangular A, is 16. Let us see at point B. So point B is this rectangle. So total expenditure will be price into quantity, that is 4, 4. 4 4s are 16 again. So area is 16 again. Here area is, equal to the total expenditure here, because we are talking about quantity demanded and price. So when we again talk about area of rectangle A and B, it is the same with the total expenditure, and total expenditure is, derived by multiplying price and quantity. So 8 2s are 16 in case of rectangular A. Rectangle B, 4 4s are 16. Let us see at point C. Share price is 2 and then quantity demanded is 8. So 2 8 is 16. So in all the point or A, B, C, in all the rectangle A, B, C, their area is equal to 16, so 3 of them. So that is why we have the rectangular hyperbola demand curve, and then the price elasticity in all the points A, B, C equals to 1. So unitary price elasticity when it comes to rectangular hyperbola type demand curve. So their price elasticity will be equal to 1 in this case. So the last case that we have to discuss is we are comparing price elasticity at two intersecting demand curves. So what happens to price elasticity at a point of intersection of a two demand curve in the diagram, that is DD and D dash D dash. These are the two demand curve, and at X we are measuring quantity demanded, Y-axis price, and O is the origin. So what happens to the price elasticity when two demand curve intersect? So C is the point of intersection between two demand curve, that is DD and D dash D dash. So what is their price elasticity at point C? So if two demand curve intersect at their point of intersection, price elasticity is greater along the flatter demand curve. So when these two demand curve intersects, price elasticity at this point of intersection will be greater for the demand curve which has a flatter curve in nature. So a flatter demand curve will have a greater price elasticity when two demand curve intersects. So this is represented in this diagram. So D dash D dash is flatter than D demand curve, and they intersect at point C. So at point C, what do we observe here? Quantity demanded is QO. So quantity demanded at this point is AOQO, and then price at this, intersecting point is OPO. So let us suppose that price of the commodity, rises from OPO to OP1. So it will be seen from this figure 13, that when prices rises from OPO to OP1, we see that the demand curve D dash D dash, with the rise in price of OP to OP1, the fall in quantity demanded is OQO, OQ2. So when the price has risen from OPO to OP1, the demand curve, which is flatter, say the flatter demand curve is D dash D dash, quantity demanded is, OQ2. So earlier both of them, they were demanding at OQO, but now because of the change in price, in case of a flatter demand curve, that is D dash D dash, quantity demanded has changed from or shifted from OQO to OQ2, which is a great shift. But in case of the demand curve, which has a steeper demand curve, the amount of quantity that has changed because of the fall in price is just from OQO to OQ1, which is a very little amount. So demand curve, which is steeper in nature, the quantity demanded change is very less when price has increased. But when price has increased for a demand curve which has a flatter nature, the quantity demanded is OQO, OQ2. So the shift or the change in quantity demanded is very huge. So we can conclude and say that, if two demand curve intersect at their point of intersection, the price elasticity is greater along the flatter demand curve. So because of the change in price, the quantity demanded for the demand curve D dash D dash, which is a flatter demand curve, the quantity demanded, the percentage change in quantity demanded because of the change in price is very huge, comparing with the demand curve, which has a steeper in nature DD. So in case of DD, the change is very less, but in case of a demand curve which has a flatter curve, the change is very huge. So a flatter demand curve will indicate a greater price elasticity when two demand curve intersects. So the last topic that we are left with in this chapter number 5 is the determinants of price elasticity of demand. So what are the factors that is determining the elasticity or price elasticity of demand? So the first one that we have is the availability of close substitutes. Of all the factors that is determining price elasticity of demand, the availability of close substitute for a commodity is the most important factor. What is it? Close substitutes and price elasticity has to do. So if for a commodity close substitutes are available, so for a particular commodity, if there is a close substitute, its demand tends to be elastic. Their demand will be elastic. And opposite to that, if there are goods that has no close substitutes, then demand or price elasticity for that commodity will be inelastic. For example, if price of such commodity goes up, in case of a commodity which have a close substitute, if the price of a commodity goes up, people will shift to its close substitutes, and as a result, demand for that commodity will greatly decline because they have other substitute to replace instead of that commodity if that good has increased in price. So the greater the possibility of substitution, the greater will be the price elasticity of demand for it. So let us give an example of Coca-Cola. So if price of Coca-Cola rises, many consumers would turn to other kinds of cold drinks because Coca-Cola has many close substitutes and the demand for Coca-Cola will decline drastically. Opposite to that, let's take an example of a common sol. Common sol is inelastic in demand because they have no close substitute, and even if price of common sol increases, the demand for common sol will not be affected because of the change in price. So for commodity which has no substitutes, no close substitutes, price elasticity is inelastic in nature. The second factor that is determining the price elasticity of demand is the proportion of consumers' income spent on consumption. So this is another important determinant of elasticity of demand for a commodity. So how much it accounts for in consumers' budget. So you are consuming particular commodity, how much it accounts for your budget, that will also determine the price elasticity of demand. In other words, the proportion of consumers' income that he spend on particular commodity also influence the elasticity of demand for it. The greater the proportion of income spent on a commodity, the greater will generally be its elasticity of demand, and vice versa. So the demand for common soul, like common soap, matchbox, and such other goods tends to be highly inelastic because household spends only a fraction of their income on each of them, and when price of such a commodity rises, it will not make much difference in consumers' budget. So their price elasticity is inelastic because they are spending a little fraction of their income. For example, a luxury commodity, let us say, for luxury commodity, their price elasticity will be very high because a huge part of the consumer's income is spent on that. And when that luxury item changes its price, the demand for those luxury items or luxury goods will also change in huge quantity, or the demand will change. When there is a rise in the price of a luxury commodity, their quantity demanded will decline drastically, and if price falls for that luxury commodity, the demand for the luxury items will increase drastically. So a big percentage change can take place when because of the change in price. That is in case of a luxury commodities or items, because a consumer is expending or spending, a consumer's expenditure or his expenditure is much more higher in case of luxury commodities. So when he spends a good amount or a huge portion of his income, the price elasticity is also very high. It is very elastic comparing with the goods or commodities that a consumer gives a little fraction of its income. So in conclusion, what we can say is that when a consumer devote his income in a very little amount, price elasticity is inelastic. And when a consumer devote his income in a huge portion, then price elasticity is very high. The third factor is the number of users of a commodity. So here we see is that the greater the number of uses to which a commodity can be put, the greater will be its price elasticity of demand. For example, if price of a commodity having several uses is very high, let us say milk, their demand will be small. So if the price for milk is very high, then people will demand less. Why? Because their uses are of many, and when the price is very high, they will use for a very only important purposes. But when price is low, then they will use that particular milk for very many purposes, and they will demand more. So according to the number of users of a commodity, price elasticity also changes. So the higher the number of users or number of ways in which the commodity can be used, the greater will be the elasticity or price elasticity of demand. To repeat the example, let us say milk. Milk has several uses, and if its price rise to a very high level, it will be used only for essential purposes, such as feeding the children and sick persons. But if price of milk falls, as I mentioned, it would be devoted to other use, such as preparation of curd, cream, ghee, sweets, etc. Therefore, the demand for milk tends to be elastic, because milk has several uses, or it can be used for several purposes. So the greater the number of ways in which a commodity can be used, the greater its elasticity. Fourth one is nature of a commodity, that is between necessities and luxurious goods. So between necessity goods and luxurious goods, price elasticity also differs. So generally, demand for necessity goods such as food grains, common salt, they tend to be inelastic because consumers cannot reduce their demand much when their price rises. So no good substitutes for these essential products are available. Because of that, their demand or price elasticity is inelastic. Opposite to that, demand for luxuries such as big size color TVs, air conditioners, expensive cars tend to be elastic because their consumption can be easily cut off with their high price. When price increases for necessity goods, expenses can be cut off, or expenditure can be cut off, and they will demand less of luxurious items if price increases. But in case of necessity goods, their demand is inelastic, because whether the price increase or decrease, they will demand that good, because it is a necessity good. But in case of luxurious items, when price falls, or when price increases, their demand is highly affected. So it is very elastic in nature. So the last one is time and elasticity, which is the last factor for price elasticity of demand. And what we can see is that demand tends to be more elastic in the long run. So demand is elastic or more elastic in the long run, but in the short run demand is inelastic. So let us give an illustration for that. Why demand tends to be more elastic in the long run? This is because consumers can substitute goods in the long run. So in the short run, substitution of one commodity by another is not so easy. So the longer the period of time, the greater is the ease to extend to which both consumers and businessmen can substitute one commodity for another. So if price of fuel oil rises, it may be very difficult to substitute fuel oil by other types of fuels, such as coal, or cooking gas. But given a sufficient time, people will make adjustment, or they will invent something new to replace fuel. So in the long run, demand is elastic. So in the short run, what happens? When the business firms find that the price of a certain material has risen, it may not be immediately possible for them to substitute that material for some other relative cheaper ones. So in the short run, it is very difficult to change things. So it is inelastic in the short run, the demand. But with the passage of time, they can undertake research to find out new methods to substitute the material, and can redesign their product or modify their production process for manufacturing that same commodity. But in the short run, that is not possible. So in the short run, demand is or usually inelastic, and in the long run, demand is elastic in nature. So those are the 5 determinants of price elasticity of demand. And with that, we have come to the end of this chapter number 5, that is price elasticity of demand.